This is Tim, and this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Tim in Tokyo. In this episode, more from my visit to the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library and Museum at Ohio State University. By total coincidence, I happened to be there at the same time as Stephen Bissette, penciler on Alan Moore's Swamp Thing run in the 80s, and an instructor at the Center for Cartoon Studies in White River Junction, Vermont. He's been on the podcast several times before, most recently in episode 511 last year. He was in Columbus on a summer research road trip with Craig Fischer, who teaches at Appalachian State University and occasionally writes for the Comics Journal. Steve's restarting his 90s dinosaur comic Tyrant, and related to that, he was at the Billy Ireland to look into earlier iterations of dinosaur comics. Keep listening to find out why. Also in this episode, our old friend Tom Spurgeon, who writes the Comics Reporter blog and also organizes the Billy Ireland's Cartoon Crossroads Columbus Festival, or CXC, which this year will be held September 28th to October 1st. I talked with him about settling into Columbus, organizing the festival and this year's guests, and also got his take on Mulele's often asked questions about the state of mainstream American comics. Steve Bissette and Craig Fischer in a moment. First, just a reminder that you can help this podcast by making your Amazon purchases via deconstructingcomics.com/Amazon and make that your bookmark for future purchases. We'll then get a percentage of what you spend. It costs you nothing extra and helps us cover web hosting and the other costs of presenting this show every week. We really appreciate your support. Okay, so now I am in Columbus, and visiting the Billy Ireland Museum at Ohio State University, and it just so happens that Steve Bissette is here at the same time from Vermont. What are the chances?
Ta-da! Yeah, exactly.
Okay, and he's here with Craig Fischer. And introduce yourself. You've never been on the podcast.
Yeah, hi, I'm Craig Fischer, and I'm a professor of English at Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina. And I write about comics sometimes. I'm involved a little bit with the programming at Heroes Con in Charlotte every year. I have an intermittent column at the Comics Journal website, and doing research here, but also going along on the trip and seeing Steve.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Craig and I met years ago, and we've been friends for quite a while now. And Craig has brought me in too long. And Craig
after this is the end.
No, this is the next threshold we're on. And Craig had me down to ASU, where I was a guest lecturer, but we also put together pretty amazing film night, I thought. At the theater there.
Absolutely. I'd never seen Dutchman. The film version of Dutchman.
I cleared permission to show this rare 1967 film based on the play by Leroy Jones called Dutchman, and there was a film version made in England, and it's essentially a lost film. And we showed that and followed it with George Romero and Image 10's Night of the Living Dead. And we cleared permission with the widow of the producer of Dutchman to show it. And we cleared permission with Image 10 and Russ Streiner, who played the brother who buys it in the graveyard at the beginning, to show Night, where a lot of colleges just treat it as, yes, they're coming to get you, Barbara. And most colleges show it as a public domain film. But we set it up as a legit
That was the
show.
right thing to do.
It was the right thing to do. And I was so happy. You got big brownie points by going along with that one. So anyway, we go way back, and this was our chance to do some research here at the Billy Ireland, which is just an amazing resource.
It absolutely
So, what's your research going to be about?
I'm here in the capacity of, this summer I've restarted work on Tyrant, which was my self-published comic project back in the 90s, and my goal was to do the birth, life, and death of a Tyrannosaurus Rex, and before the capital city distribution collapse and the implosion of the direct market, I only got through the birth. So I spent a fortune and a lot of time last year finishing an unfinished room in our house over the garage. That's my new drawing studio. And
judging from the photographs on Facebook, it looks beautiful.
It's a great workspace, and I had a contractor design and build shelves, so I've got all my research books up there, all my paleontology texts, all my biology and zoology texts. So I've got everything in reach, and removed computers from the room. I still work old school, Tim. You know, cut Bristol board, everything but the Ames lettering guide. I'm not going to use that this time.
You're going to have a font from your handwriting?
No, I'm actually talking with Todd Klein. Todd Klein and I have known each other for years, but I don't believe we worked together except for him lettering Jack and the Green, the Neil Gaiman story that... although John Costanza may have lettered that story, because Neil wanted to put the Swamp Thing team together for that. So Todd's going to letter the first Tyrant story I've got on my boards right now. I completely scripted and workshopped 2 original Tyrant self-standing stories, and one of them is called The Smells, and I rewrote Edgar Allan Poe's The Bells to fit the first day at the nest with Tyrant, and sort of, as best I could, channeled the old Harvey Kurtzman approach to Mad Magazine great poetry parodies. And then the second piece, and Todd's going to letter that, and he's agreed to do it old school lettering. He says he hasn't done that in quite a number of years because everyone switched to digital.
Right.
And I really want to be doing all this on Bristol board with brush and ink. And I also spent much of last year fundraising for various individuals, and I used that to sell sketches. I offer sketches for donations, and I worked hard to get my inking chops as best I could back up to where I was when I was doing Tyrant in the 90s, because it's not like just climbing back on a bicycle. You know, it's it took a while to really, you know, exercise those muscles again, even though I've been drawing all along. I'm not the youthful pup I was in the 90s. So I'm here to research as much as they have in their archives and their collections here of paleontologically themed comics going back to the late 1800s. You know, the first real body of work that involved paleontology was in Punch magazine. A cartoonist named E.T. Reed had a continuing series of single panel gag strips with cavemen and faux dinosaurs called Prehistoric Peeps. And that sort of kicked off the whole genre. And I'm going to be working on new Tyrant material and rewriting and redrawing what was Tyrant 1 through 3 to fit the current paleontology model. My great friend Rick Veach convinced me, it didn't take a lot of arm twisting, he said, Steve, you know, before you get that out, because it's going to take a couple of years to get that work done, just do an archival edition of the original Tyrant, you know, what saw print back in the 90s. So I'm going to include, and he's right, I should do that. And I'm going to include the letters pages and articles that I can clear reprint permission on from people who back then I had paid to write articles and allowed me to print articles of their work. And I'm doing a history of dinosaurs in comic art as part of that. And so I'm here to spend 2 days just scouring what's here. We're working with the librarians here at the Billy Ireland. We've already exchanged lists with them, and I'm going to be diving in after this podcast. That's what I'm here for.
Right.
So, and Craig.
Well, I'm here for 3 reasons. One is because Steve said, let's road trip, and I got excited about that. But also, I have 2 projects I'm working on. One is a long-term project with Charles Hatfield about Eddie Campbell, and I asked the librarians here at the Billy Ireland to get up whatever materials they had having to do with Campbell, particularly the issues of escape that they have. That's a hard magazine to find. I've spent
Paul Gravet's magazine,
right? Exactly, right. From the mid 1980s to mid to late 1980s in England, that published a lot of Campbell's early work. The early Alec work appeared there, and that was pretty groundbreaking for him. It brought Campbell's work to a national audience. And so I'm going to be looking at the collection of escapes that they have here. And also, Steve brought along some original art of Eddie's that you actually have in your possession that I had a chance to look at. So
yeah, the other reason for this trip is I'm donating chunks of my collection, you know, my personal original art collection, my parts of my graphic novels and comics collections that fit the parameters of what they need or are looking for here. So as part of this trip, Tim, my car was full. The trunk was
You said the whole back seat,
the
too,
whole
right?
back seat and the trunk were full with the initial donation.
Right.
And they were overjoyed. And I didn't just show up with the stuff. I did I cataloged all the material, emailed them the list with notations before coming here. So they
were warned.
Susan and Jenny and Wendy knew what was coming in, and they were very excited.
Yeah,
and Craig got in yesterday afternoon,
Right.
late in the day, so
Yep.
I spent my first afternoon here just powwowing with the people here at the Billy Ireland that I'm going to be working with and establishing a methodology for getting the rest of the collection to them in the coming years, because it's going to be a few-year project. I've kept everything, and they want business documents and everything. I've donated a lot of the early business materials and a lot of my self-publishing career materials to HUIE Library in Henderson State University in Arkadelphia, Arkansas. And they reached a point of crying uncle. I think once they got a room and a half of stuff, it was like, whoa! So, the rest is going to be coming here to the Billy Ireland.
It's great.
Yeah, so I brought the first load, including a lot of original art, including some Eddie Campbell pieces that were in my collection. So, yeah.
Okay. So, do dinosaurs have feathers?
Many do. It's pretty clear evidence that many did. Fossil record is pretty clear. My first summer trip to research Tyrant was up to Ottawa. Dr. Michael Ryan, who's the curator at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, ironically enough. When I was originally planning this trip, I was going to come through Cleveland because I did just drive through Cleveland to get here. But Michael was going to be in Greenland on a fossil dig. And we just couldn't work out the timing because his institutional schedule, and I teach at the Center for Cartoon Studies, for both of us, this summer is like primo field work time. So we just couldn't coordinate a window of opportunity where I'd be coming here at a time when Craig and I could do what we're doing here. Michael was going to be away, so I took the drive from where I live in Vermont up to Ottawa and spent 3.5 days with Michael. His home is in Ottawa. And we went through every page and every panel that exists of Tyrant, and Michael just pulled it all apart in terms of the science, in terms of, he's also a lifelong comics reader and has co-written issues of Xenozoic Tales, Cadillacs and Dinosaurs with Mark Schultz. And so, getting Michael's input, I essentially workshopped those issues of Tyrant with a paleontologist. And that gives me what I'm going to be working on over the winter months and into next year on reworking. But I also workshopped the 2 new Tyrant stories with Michael. This is my long answer to your question, because Michael sent me home with a thumb drive full of academic paleontological papers from the last 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, a lot is more has become known since you did the
much.
first part of Tyrant.
And the whole reconstructive picture of how those prehistoric animals looked and behaved and so on is light years away from where it was in the mid-'90s when I was doing Tyrant. So I've got to reteach myself. And Michael, on that thumb drive I brought home, on that stick I brought home, is the paper on Tyrannosaurus rex that, to Michael's satisfaction, proves conclusively Tyrannosaurus rex did not have feathers. Okay? They've got fossilized skin impressions. They're able to read the genetic code in a lot of fossils these days because there's technologies that exist now that just weren't in existence then. And T-Rex did not have feathers at any stage of their life, according to a number of the experts in that field. So I'm satisfied that I don't have to teach myself to redraw T-Rex to that extreme. But I have had to revise completely, and it's hard. I'm an old dog, and it's a new trick, and so it's hard to kind of unlearn I've got to lose a lot of habits that I developed.
And that's part of why you're looking at the art here, to sort of see how other people.
Yeah, I am only going to draw Tyrant in the style of V.T. Hamlin.
There you go. I was thinking,
I think Dinny is the way to go.
Since this is Sullivan Hall, I think you should draw it in.
Sullivan did some prehistoric animal gags.
Well, I guess yeah. So then the question is, I mean, a lot more is known now. So what's useful about looking at what was done before?
Well, what's useful in what was done before is, I mean, I'm a comics historian now, and because I've been teaching for a dozen years, even though I'm not a professor, I don't have any degrees, but I've been teaching at Center for Cartoon Studies. My primary class is the comics history class. I think it's really important to understand where you're coming from. Like all of us as cartoonists, whether we're cognizant of not, or whether we're aware of it or not, earlier generations of cartoonists laid all the bedrock we build on. And for me, part of the fun of doing an archival book of Tyrant is not just to lay out what I was doing in the 90s, but also what came before, like what shaped this genre. And it's a very peculiar subgenre, right? Specifically, what Ricardo Delgado with Age of Reptiles, what Jim Lawson with Paleo, which Dover Graphic Novels put out the definitive collection last year of Jim Lawson's Paleo, two of which I scripted, because Jim and I are friends. And what I'm doing, what I did and what I'm now doing with Tyrant is part of a very narrow subgenre of comics in which they're not comic strips or comic books that feature dinosaurs. I'm going to be discussing and having sidebars on westerns that had dinosaurs and time travel stories. It was Young Earth, which was the backup strip in Turok, Son of Stone, which was probably scripted by Paul Newman, not the actor, but the writer who wrote for Western publications.
And he's one of the most prolific comics writers of all time.
He and why am I drawing a blank? The guy who wrote the Tarzan, Gaylord Dubois, were probably the most prolific comic script writers of all time. Bob Kanigher's definitely got a spot in there.
Yeah, he's definitely.
They had a backup strip called Young Earth, and they were all stories in the vein of a lot of the Dell Animal comics, right? Lassie, Hi-Yo Silver. I mean, that was a genre of comics, animal comics, dogs and horses and so on. Young Earth would tell a story about a dinosaur. And those were really important to me as a kid. And there was nowhere in the pop culture where you got stories like that other than children's books and that backup in Turok. And that's kind of the ground zero of this field that Ricardo's, Jim's work, and my work has been mining. And I've never seen anybody write about it. I've never seen anyone discuss that as a cohesive, strong body of work that had a real presence. It was read by millions of kids. The Turoks were selling huge numbers. So that's what I'm specifically tracking, and I think it's invaluable to. You've read Taboo. I mean, when I was editing Taboo, it was important to me with the introductions to present to the reader a context of here's who did this story you're about to read, and here's how it fits into the horror genre. So for me, the appendix material in the archival Tyrant, I see part of my task is to really present this a coherent history of what's this genre I'm working in. I didn't make it up.
Okay, so this book is going to have not just your early Tyrant work, but more of a kind of a context for it.
Well, yeah, I'd like to, for instance, one of the things that Susan, the librarian that Craig and I are going to be working with primarily today and tomorrow, they've got one of the definitive collection of V.T. Hamlin's Alley-Oop. His Sundays used to have a single panel, which was the part of the strip that newspapers could drop depending on their formatting. And it was little one-panel, portraits of dinosaurs with what was factual about them in 1931 and 32 and 33. And we're going to arrange to have the scanning done of that material. Alley-Oop has been collected, but no one's looked at that. That is probably the first nonfiction dinosaur comic feature that ever existed. And it was coherent, and Hamlin had a very distinctive drawing style. And I want to present those as one of the galleries. So, and the way it works with the Billy Ireland, for your listeners, is they can't grant the permission. They've got the source material.
Right.
So this is a two-part job. I'm going to do the legwork here to arrange for the scans. Then I've got to go to the syndicate and negotiate the permissions and pay for the permissions to include that. But I think that's invaluable in the back of a Tyrant archival edition. Like, here's the guy who started it in North America, V.T. Hamlin.
Right.
All due, respects to Hamlin, and let's look at that body of work. No one's reprinted that. It's always been considered ephemeral, Mm-hmm. And I don't believe they have any original art here. We'll find out tomorrow from the Young Earth. But this is the place to start to ask. If anyone does have it in an institution, it would either be here or one of the other. A lot of that stuff is scattered to the winds,
Right.
And that work, probably lost. I mean, a lot of that work had no value in the comic art collector market. Who wanted those? It didn't even have Turok and Ander in it. Who would want those pages? So that stuff may have been lost or destroyed ages ago. But I hope to find out.
Okay.
If you enjoyed that, there's more where that came from. The three of us had a really fun discussion about Adam West and Batman in the August 31st episode of To the Batpoles, number 69. Even if you're not a Batman 66 fan, it's worth your time to look up that episode. Coming up, Tom Spurgeon talks about Cartoon Crossroads Columbus and the state of mainstream American comics. Thanks to your help, a few months back we hit a Patreon goal that unlocked the re-release of episodes 116 to 130. I've been re-releasing them in reverse order, so everything back to episode 123, my interview with Jane's World creator Paige Braddock, is now available. You should be seeing them at the lower end of your podcast feed, but if not, you can find them on our website. On the left sidebar, scroll down to April 2008 in the archives. I've been releasing them rather slowly to avoid maxing out my monthly quota of server space on our podcast host. But with $7 more per month, we'll reach our next goal, which will not only unlock another 15 old episodes, but will allow me to increase our quota so that I can re-release those classic episodes more quickly without having to cut back on new content. Soon our Patreon page will feature some fun correspondence from the papers of one Stan Lee, available to patrons giving at the $3 a month level or higher. You won't want to miss it, so pledge today. Go to patreon.com/deconcomics and pledge at least $3 a month. Another advantage of pledging at that level is that if you're publishing your own comic or a comics podcast or some other comics-related activity, we'll give you a promo on the podcast once a month, as long as you continue to pledge at least $3 a month. We really appreciate your support. When you watched Batman as a kid, you enjoyed the colorful heroes and villains, the text sound effects on the screen, the thrill of watching a heroic crime fighter escaping from death traps and taking down bad guys. But the show was devised to interest adults, too. What did you miss as a kid? Sexual innuendo.
The penguin's too small for me.
Closeted gay characters.
I like that cape, Batman.
Freudian death traps.
Has the giant clam really swallowed Robin?
Police incompetence.
Bruce Wayne is a millionaire playboy. Hardly a secret identity for Batman.
Whether you're a kid or an adult, there's something to like about our favorite Caped Crusader. Tim and Paul dig for the deeper meanings under the Batmania every first, third, and fifth Thursday of the month. What's the podcast's name?
To the Batpoles. To the Batpoles. To the Batpoles.
Okay, so here's Tom Spurgeon for the first time in person. How are you doing?
I'm doing just fine. It's nice to meet you.
Yeah, nice to finally meet in person. We've been on our show a bunch of times, but hadn't met you in person before.
Always intoxicated. That was the good part about always butt naked and drunk as a skunk. So this is very different. I'm sober. That's all I mean.
And fully clothed.
Well, that's good. Yeah, I wasn't going to mention that.
Yeah. So you've been in Columbus now how long?
I have been here more than 2 years. So I think it was 2 years March.
Okay.
So enough, yeah. Once you reach that anytime you move, this is something the comics people know because a lot of them tend to move from place to place. But after 2 years, you get to complain about new people.
Oh.
So that's a big threshold you cross where you're just like, oh, this new people and their traffic and they're terrible.
They're messing up our town.
That's right. They're messing up our town. And so once you get past the 2 year, you get that. In Seattle, they actually give you like I think it's like a poker chip when you've been there 2 years, and you show that so everyone knows that you're on that side. But yeah, no, it's been 2.5 years. What I found astonishing the other day is that Noah Van Sciver, the cartoonist, redid his Rent. So he's been here more than a year now, which is astonishing. The years are going to fly by. It's just going to be a rapid succession of like 12 or 15 images repeated until I die, I think, is what I'm in for. But I'm a proud Columbus resident now. Haven't bought my house yet, but I have had that conversation and am happy to be here. It's been a lot of fun.
What do they call people who live in Columbus?
I don't know.
Columbusans.
Awesome. That's what they call them. They call them awesome. I don't know. I don't know what the and I think, I work with a lot of people who do that kind of branding, so you'd think I'd know. I'm a Midwestern kid. I'm from my hometown's about 2.5 hours away from here. It's Muncie, Indiana, home of Ball State University, and Jim Davis lives there, the cartoonist. And born and raised over there, and we never thought about Columbus, which is weird because Columbus is huge. Columbus is a top 20 population city.
Yeah, it's the biggest city in Ohio.
It is the biggest city in Ohio, and we always got more play, maybe because of the sports teams for Cleveland and
no pro team here.
But you drive through it, and like sometimes we would go. I remember once when I was a kid going to the zoo. But we never thought of this as one of our, and it's close. Like I said, it's 2.5 hours away. Chicago, it's like, an hour more than that. We were very Chicago-oriented, much more so than Columbus. So Columbus was always kind of a big mystery. I remember actually looking it up because when I was at Comics Journal out in Seattle, our big thing was kind of these long interviews. And 2 of the early long interviews we did were with Jeff Smith, and another one we did with Paul Pope. And that's how I kind of started to learn things about Columbus. And I was like, that town that you kind of drive through on your way out to Pittsburgh or to Pennsylvania or to the East Coast, was that big? So I've always been kind of fascinated. And as I've been here, it does have that nice kind of blend of all the big city things you'd want. Pretty good food, pretty good shopping, pretty good entertainment options in terms of people when they come through on tours. People usually stop here, and there are some sports. The only professional sport here is hockey, but it has that big town feel. You don't feel like you're wanting for everything. And having just lived in a town of 6,000 in the mountains of New Mexico, that was a refreshing change. But it's also not. It's not a difficult town to get around in. Everything's about 15 minutes drive from everything else, mostly. It's not intimidating or huge or tough. I went to grad school in Chicago, to name another big city. And one thing I always remember about Chicago is it was just kind of hard to be not have a lot in your pocket. Like it would cost you money to get from neighborhood to neighborhood and a significant amount of time. And it was tougher than this town is. I think this town's pretty easygoing, pretty laid back, and very Midwestern. Everybody's friendly, and they have that wonderful mix of kind of arrogance and total self-recriminating self-hatred at the same time that the Midwest can sometimes have, which is fascinating to see kind of play across someone's face. And out here, another thing is, which is a big change, and that I've enjoyed a lot, is that when I was in Silver City, New Mexico, which is where I was before here, having come down there from Seattle in the 90s when I worked at Fantagraphics, when I was in Silver City, I went there when there was only one show that you had to go to, which was San Diego, and one show you maybe had to go to, which was SPX, as it was growing. And so I thought, I can drive to San Diego, I'll suck it up and take the plane out. And then 10 years later, there was 17 shows a year I wanted to go to, and I was 3.5 hours from an airport. So you'd come home from these trips exhausted, and you had to drive 3.5 hours.
What airport did you use?
If I went east, it was El Paso, and if I went west, it was Tucson. Now they actually have one of those government-supported tiny airlines there, which I always celebrate my happiness that there being a tiny airline. 6-seaters, fly out like twice a day of Silver City to Albuquerque or Tucson or Phoenix or El Paso. I always celebrate the joy at having a flight option by vomiting in the tiny plane. I found that I can't travel in those tiny planes now that I'm old. It just shakes up my stomach. Last time I was on, I went from Albuquerque to Silver City on this little tiny plane and actually vomited on the shoes of our state senator, Howie Morales, who had just lost the governor's race. So I imagine that might have been an even worse day for Howie. Was when the large man in the back row projectile vomited up onto his shoes, right up the row. So that's a lot. But when I got here, I remember I flew to like Toronto show or something, and I got back and I was 8 minutes from my house at the airport, and I was like, I nearly cried. It was like such a relief because you think like when you're traveling 7 or 8 times a year and
I'm at the airport already.
6 years, that's like you're wasting like 60, 70 hours of your life just driving to the airport. And after 9/11, of course, like all the regional airports fly out once a day or twice. So there's not options that there were 100 years ago. Back in the 90s, I remember going from Seattle to Bethesda for an SPX, and it was round trip $105. You had to fly through Houston. You couldn't go direct. But you just don't like the anywhere that's kind of considered not even it's not one of the 3 airports that everyone flies to. It's not LAX or one of the New Yorks or Chicago or Atlanta. Always seems to cost a little more. So I love being out here. I can drive to most of the shows that are out here, and like I said, it's 8 minutes away to the airport. Yeah. And you get old; those kind of things matter. And there's a nice comic culture here. We're in the magnificent. Billy Ireland Cartoon Library and Museum. We're in Caitlin McGurk's office, just throwing stuff around and knocking stuff onto the floor.
She told me not to touch anything. We're in her office now, but want some Skittles?
Yeah, we're touching
little tray on the
Caitlin,
table.
we're touching everything. Sorry. And this is I met someone in Toronto, one of the French industry members, publishing industry, and he said he had just been after they'd opened a few years back in this new facility, and he said, I said, it's really one of the nicest places for comics. And he said, no, I think it's the nicest place for comics. And there's something to that. I mean, not only are their holdings kind of magnificent, and you can come here and do research. We both ran into Steve Bissette and Craig Fischer, the academic, out in the study room where they bring you materials, and Steve is doing what every good comic scholar does, which is having, 300 pages of Frederick Opper comics and stuff like that brought to him, that's amazing in and of itself. But there's something about like the culture of comics being kind of this scruffy garage sale. The early shops were kind of rough, and just to have a place where it's super, like it's just nice, like it's a big, nice, clean, giant ceiling. Lovely facility, and all the people who work here are just like super, super sharp.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
We don't, like when I worked at Fantagraphics in the 90s, I always joked that we looked like the lineup outside a methadone clinic compared to what people do now. And we were a rough crew, It's like one of those, it's like a John Waters film, we don't expect to pull switchblades on people.
This place looks like, any university office, and you're like, this is all for comics?
Yeah, no,
it's like there are Nancy panels on the wall in this office, and there's a Alfred E. Newman mask, and all this comic stuff all over in here in every room. It's crazy.
Yeah, Steve Bissette just mentioned something. They had donated to them the collector and zine publisher Larry Ivey. All of his works published, and that includes a lot of areas that aren't comics that Steve is interested in. But one thing, just look at just a random jewel, which is all these films that he made in Central Park of people cosplaying, and
we saw the box full of films earlier.
Yeah, it is. That just happens to be that,
and the costumes that were worn, the Captain America and Batman and Robin, and
so it's just like crazy. Yeah, it's this crazy like bunch of stuff, and it's also like the nicest people in the world. I think when people come here for CXC, this is truly the belle of the ball in terms of people just being like, it is so nice there, and we're not used to nice things yet in comics. We're still very much sometimes there's things that are good about it, but we're still very much not used to first-rate facilities and first-rate stuff. It kind of blows us away a little bit.
Yeah.
And so this place is nice. That's good. And, the local cartooning scene, and we're getting more people in. And CCAD, which is an art school south of, or kind of the southeast portion of downtown, has a comics major this year with a focus on comics writing, which I think is kind of new. So we're going to have 20 to 45 kids, coming through here every fall that want to make and enjoy and figure out how to do comics and what that can teach them. It's a good time to be here. I'm super happy about that. And so that's worked out well so far.
So you're in charge of planning Comics Crossroads Columbus, CXC you call it?
Yeah, they call it CXC. We got that sexy X right in the middle.
For Crossroads.
It's a crossroads symbol. And also if you kind of say CXC kind of almost sounds like sexy. We didn't do that on purpose. I think Jeff Smith might have done that on purpose. But yeah, no, I'm one of two staff people now. We hired a second staff person this year, and I'm what they call the executive director. So I'm in charge of basically programming and hospitality. So I work with the guests I work to invite the guests, I work to welcome the guests into town, and then I put them into a programming matrix where everyone gets to see the guests and have fun. And we hired someone this year to take some logistics pressure off of me. Not just because that's a lot of work, but because I'm terrible at it. So that there are things in my skill set that Melody Reed, who is our new operations manager, will be able to do that I'm bad at, and that will be a great benefit to the show. But we have a very active Jeff Smith, the cartoonist, is our festival president. Lucy Caswell, who built this place as the founding curator, is our vice president, and we have a very active Columbus board, and we have a bunch of institutions such as the Columbus Museum of Art that kind of and the Wexner Center, which is across the street here and is very comics interested. They do a lot of inviting and hosting, and so we kind of wrangle all of these venues into a 4-day weekend. And it's been a lot of fun. It's been a lot harder than I thought in terms of how would I say this? There was a decision that we made pretty early on that we couldn't let it grow naturally. We couldn't start out with 2 guests and go to 6 guests and go to 8 guests and hope that people would kind of build, the audience could slowly develop. We kind of had to go big mostly because I think some of these institutions wanted to play a part and have a role. And when the local Museum of Art says we want to invite Ron Wimberly and show a bunch of his art in our museum, you don't say, wait a couple of years. So we had to get big fast, and I think that the festival space is so kind of crowded, and so many people are enjoying the festival space that we didn't want to kind of step into it half-assed, I think would be the term. So we at least in terms of our ambitions we're pretty big. We're like a 25 guest show, and we hope that there are people that are wanting to come and see it. We hope so. We'll put on a good show, and we're in 6 different venues, and we're all over town, and we have hosted parties in other neighborhoods so that we can show off Columbus, because that's one of our things is we want to show people Columbus and hope people move here. So yeah, there was no I had a meeting the day after I moved into town, and it seems like I haven't stopped yet. And there's so much more to do, in terms of securing the local part of arts funding and finding out things that we can do to generate income, maybe. Those and who might give us some money to do things here and there. Because we want to stay a free festival. So it's been kind of nonstop in a way. But I think in a good way, and I hope that we're creating something that can last a very long time.
Now, this is not the kind of festival where people set up booths and sell their comics, right?
There is an element of that. We do have an expo and marketplace, yeah. Okay. And we talked about that because there are shows that don't do that at all. There are certainly conferences and shows. There are even things that they call comics festivals. There's one in Switzerland called Fumetto, which is almost entirely 30 exhibits around town. Not only kind of panel programming, but just kind of straight up art exhibits. And you kind of get what's going on, and you drift around to the different things. And there's one shop you go to that carries all the special guest stuff, and no one really sets up. So we talked about that kind of model, if that was doable for us. And what we decided was that it is so important for a lot of younger cartoonists and young at heart cartoonists that they have an opportunity to kind of directly meet fans and to do that. So we curate very highly. We try to have a very high quality of person, and we will.
So people apply.
People apply. We have anywhere from like 3 to 5 over the last 3 years as people wanted to be here as we can let in, and we max out at about 100 tables and probably 120 cartoonists, and that includes our 25 special guests. So you take some off the. But the other advantage of doing a show where you have that kind of thing, even an art show, like an SPX or TCAF also have tabling at their shows, is that it's a recognizable model for a lot of people. And I think people kind of intuitively get that there are some shows where you dress up like a zombie and lurch around the show, and that we have a Wizard World coming up this weekend. But I think people kind of know that we haven't had anyone in costume even yet. Even though SPX will still get a person occasionally that'll dress up, not kind of getting the models are different. But I think people kind of do get that it's more of it's a reading show. It's more a literary show. It's more a library show. And it helps us that we're in the library, kind of like it helps TCAF, I think, that one of our downtown branch has given over this gigantic reading room and like 7 or 8 paneling rooms, and it's been really lovely and kind of underlining that. And it's a good library system for comics and graphic novels. They have a huge, huge section. One thing that's always fun to do every year is you kind of go to them with your list of special guests, and you see how much that their books are being checked out. And someone like Emil Ferris, who did My Favorite Thing is Monsters, like her stuff's on a waiting list of like 200 people before people will be allowed to read her book in that system. So it's a pretty good town for reading comics in that sense, and that the kind of the big books will get read and paid attention to and borrowed and bought and all of that. But yeah, we still do that kind of the old-fashioned selling thing, and there's good ways to do that and there's bad ways to do that. We're in a library, so we can't have like bells and whistles, and we can't have gigantic displays. It's all very mellow SPX, very like 1 to a few tables. But the cartoonists are nice. I think people appreciate a chance. Like if you hear about your favorite cartoonist, our poster artist this year, and I'm looking right at some of her art, Katie Skelly up there in the upper left-hand corner. And she's a cartoonist that's been growing in popularity, and she has her first book out from Fantagraphics this fall. But if you're like a big Katie Skelly fan in Cleveland, and you want to drive down, that's a treat to get to go and kind of buy stuff that she doesn't have it for sale anywhere else, and that she can talk to you while she signs it and everything. That's still a pretty cool experience. Not everyone wants to do it, and you'll get people that don't want to come, and we accommodate those people too that don't want to be out on tables. We had Ben Catchor last year. Ben Catchor wasn't hustling his latest mini or anything. He did a signing with one of his books in a dignified way at a table at the front of the show. But for a lot of these younger cartoonists, it's a way to kind of, I think it always benefits artists to like know the entirety of what they're making's life, right? Which is that they work on it themselves, they manage to get it printed, and this, later on they can work with publishers. Later on they can work with people that will take a lot of this out of their hands. But I think understanding that with your first few books, these like homemade books as you're making your name, I think it really helps them later on. I think it really helps them to know that to not have a publisher or not have a set of publishers keep it a mystery from you how things are done, and that if you have to, you can always find a way to express yourself that doesn't depend on someone else's permission. Comics Below Threshold is one of its great strengths, and we make fun of it sometimes, but it's really wonderful that you can just start making comics and going to shows, and we will probably find out about you within 6 months or 8 months. Because everyone talks and puts things online and gets excited about things they see. And, you can't do that with film. There's a lot of gatekeeping in film. There's some gatekeeping in to a significant amount of books in the book industry. And comics, you can spend a portion of your entire career. Well, John Porcellino is coming this year, the wonderful kind of the Johnny Appleseed of American mini comics, and great supporter of other people's work at the early handmade stage, as well as basically his primary mode of creating is still doing handmade mini comics and sending them out. And there's nothing less artistic about his work that he chooses to publish that way. And that's a huge, huge thing of value for comics. And while commercial comics are a wonderful thing, I wish more comics were more commercial. I would love more millionaire cartoonists. I just think that if you look back, we'll be able to look back 50, 100, 200 years from now at this kind of wave of handmade comics and people just trying to express themselves. And I think we're going to get more and more artists that kind of stay in comics for a little while and then go write TV shows or go back into animation or whatever. And so just to have this kind of collection of work that you don't get with a playwright, you don't get to see the senior, you don't get to see who's an important actor of our time. You don't get to see Daniel Day-Lewis's high school production of 12 Angry Men, but I can get access to a lot of kid comics that Art Spiegelman made or here. They have a lot of them.
This stuff in the gallery like Will Eisner did when he was 6 years old or something.
Yeah, that's an amazing thing. And when we get that in comics, and after a certain age, they even have kind of a shadow market that they follow that's a little different than the comics market, but part of it. So it's really excites me, and I really want to get those. I mean, going to a show and finding someone whose comics you like to look at and buying it from them and having that personal connection and going home and being blown away. It's how I've met a lot of cartoonists over the years and discovered a lot of cartoonists that are personal to me now. And I think that's a great experience. But like I said, I think people are comfortable with it. I think they know that even if they're not dressing up like a zombie, they're probably going to a big room where they can buy things off of tables. I think people are kind of comfortable with that. I was the original guy who complained about how weird that was, but I'm not sure where we go until we get a lot more funding in terms of being able to make those shows worth the while of the professionals to attend without coming away with a profit. And I can babble on about stuff like that, but we would love eventually to not have to charge people for shows to exhibit. Mm-hmm. We would love at the end of the weekend to present them with their money back if they stayed the entire weekend, just to encourage them to show up and stay through that last minute, but also not, in other words, to keep people from signing up for a show and then not showing up and not risking, at least not having that that incentive to table, because shows are a little weird in that they are kind of this outcrop of really commercial comics from the 70s, and I'm not sure that model fits everybody all the way. But there's, like I said, there's some things that are great about it. Maybe someday. Maybe someday this will be the show that we don't have to make people pay to come give us a show, which I always thought was a little weird. But
so who are the guests this year? I know Derf is kind of headlining.
Yeah, Derf is a real great friend of the show and was a special guest our first year. And we repeated him this year because he has the movie coming out, a movie version of My Friend Dahmer, his great graphic novel, is coming out. And it's the 40th anniversary of this facility, the Billy Ireland. And Derf was a student here and, learned about comics by coming down to the old Billy Ireland setup. What was it called? Not even that. It's called I forget what name it had at the time.
I mentioned it when I interviewed him.
Cartoon Art something. Maybe, or something. I bet whatever it was called at the time. Lucy Caswell's great library. So he's like a favorite son. He's like, that's everything that's good about this place is kind of exemplified in someone like Derf going off and having a really solid career. So we're very excited for him to have this movie, and we're going to preview it or show it exclusively or whatever the timing is. And Derf will speak. He's a wonderful speaker, and we'll speak before and after. And what's neat about that is not only do we get a great event, but I think Derf will very much enjoy kind of coming back to his alma mater with a film and kind of being able to speak to those matters. So Derf is very much an important guest for us. Chris Ware, the alternative cartoonist, will be speaking that same day, earlier in the day. He's a wonderful cartoonist and has a big art book coming out from Rizzoli Books in New York, which he is going to talk about with us. Matt Fraction and Kelly C. DeConnick, the writing, two very interesting writers that work that space, kind of between alternative comics and mainstream comics. They don't write for the mainstream companies anymore because their own work for Matt, Sex Criminals, and for Kelly Sue, Bitch Planet, I think in particular, have done well enough that they've been able to leave that behind, and they're also kind of moving into other media now. So it's very excited to have them out. They're very much good citizens of comics too, and kind of recognize and want to see the Billy, and kind of, I think Matt's been out here, but maybe not Kelly Sue. So we'll have, for instance, one of our nighttime events is Kelly Sue will be appearing at the college, Columbus College of Art and Design, with Ann Nocenti, the mainstream artist from a different generation of female comics artists from Daredevil.
High school.
Did Daredevil and has done some work since, and is one of the cooler people in comics, and then a relative newcomer, Nyla Magruder. And they'll be speaking about writing in comics. She was the first Dwayne McDuffie Diversity in Comics Awards winner, and is a really talented, she's a Disney animator, or an animator that works on stuff that eventually ends up at Disney, maybe, or maybe directly Disney. I haven't done my studying yet to know for sure. This is terrible. But they're three very accomplished comics makers, and they're going to speak on that Saturday night. So that should be a really good event for us. And we, one of the things that we do different than some comic shows, we do definitely have an animation element, and always do. And this year we got kind of a little bit, like cutting edge with it. Lily Carre and Alexander Stewart run the iWorks Animation Festival, which is a traveling festival of avant-garde kind of animation, and they're going to come here and show personal films. And then Anne-Marie Fleming, the Canadian animator who did, I always forget how to say this, but it's like I'm not even going to try. The movie she's showing is a wonderful movie called Window Horses. So and we'll have a discussion with her afterwards. And OSU's Wexner Center is a world-class destination for animators and filmmakers of all types. And the theater that we'll be using for a lot of the on-campus setup, it's the theater where Martin Scorsese has spoken, and all those people. So that should be. It's always good to see the animators, and we've had a really strong last couple of years of animators, and this year will be very strong as well. That film that Ms. Fleming is showing is an amazing film. So, yeah, and then we move down and have our 2 days down selling comics and having a good time and having panels and all of that. I'm trying to think who else is. We kind of a wave. We have some older cartoonists that we're really excited to have. Peter Bagg, the great alternative cartoonist, is going to come here behind his recent biography. Kyle Baker, who's one of the more talented guys to ever work in comics of all sorts, is going to come out, and that should be fun. Howard Cruz, the underground artist, we're very devoted to having at least one underground generation cartoonist a year, because that generation is getting older. And Howard Cruz, probably best known for Stuck Rubber Baby, his memoir comic, kind of a proto-graphic memoir that came out in the early mid, so like 93, 94. And he's a wonderful convention guest and was editor of Gay Comics for years, which was groundbreaking in terms of the underground movement. And I couldn't be happier to have him around. He's a great con guest too. So there's someone, we got all our bases covered in terms of like a few from here, a few from there. Like from the daily strips, we even have Dave Coverly, who's a Reuben Award winner, who does Speed Bump. Dana Simpson, who does Phoebe and Her Unicorn, which is a really fun newer strip that kind of came from the webcomics world. Tilly Walden will be here, who is the young superstar that has her first big book coming out from First Second, and Emil Ferris, the kind of the most best reviewed book of the year that we mentioned earlier, who did My Favorite Thing is Monsters. That's a lot of them, but that's, yeah. So I think it's a really consistent, high, kind of articulate, smart group, and kind of fits our celebration with kind of a smart edge and a kind of an intimacy that you get here that you might not get at other shows. that I think people have commented on. And we'll have a good time. It's always a good time. And then we'll keep going. Yeah, we'll just keep going after that.
Can I pick your brain about a different subject?
Yes. All right.
Marvel and DC.
Yes.
Derf mentioned when I interviewed him that Marvel has their sales are crap right now, and I don't know about how DC is doing, but Mulele keeps asking me, when we do critiquing comics, every other episode, he asks me for my take on what's going on with Marvel and DC, and I don't really know what to say. Are they dying, or what's going on there?
I just think they're in a tough place right now. For one thing, that business model basically is an extraordinary business model for these times. When you think about it, you just think about the core base, you think about people downloading 85 hours of entertainment off of their computer to watch film, and then in comics, people are still paying $3 or $4 to get 10 minutes of entertainment. Mm-hmm. That's a rarefied. I mean, that speaks to the quality of the material overall and the kind of fervent fan base that it has. I think that they've reached. I think that both companies in general, and my take on it is that DC is doing better, since they're doing better relative to Marvel than they usually do, and there's not as much external pressure on the publishing part of their company to continue to be profitable, whereas Marvel always has had the reputation, always has had the idea behind Marvel that people keep telling me is that they need to be profitable every quarter, just because of the way Disney is set up, where it's kind of the various divisions jostle to be the best managed. And so it's at Marvel where you can have a billion-dollar movie come out and then they fire 17 people at the publishing house. So it's kind of a tough model in general. The books have helped. The graphic novels have really helped, and you can see that they're all kind of leaning into these new models as best they can. Marvel announced at San Diego they're going to do more digital-only comics, which is probably might speak to their bottom line because those don't have the printing investment that they need to make back. And DC is going to work more with original graphic novels for their always fine book trade that they've had there. They've always done pretty well with book trade, and they were very early on in identifying, certain books to always keep in print and certain perennials for them. And so I think they're getting back to the point where they want to create more books like that will sell like Watchmen has, these kind of books that stand sideways to continuity. But they've been doing better with their digital their serial comics too, and especially relative to Marvel. And I just don't think there's enough people buying them anymore. Yeah. And I think what you get is a long tail situation where you go to a comic shop and there are people that there aren't those big hits anymore. There aren't a half dozen that sell over 100,000. And that, because of the non-returnable status of direct market comic shops, it is much easier if you have a few hits. Because if you order 2 of everything, you have to sell half of what you get to make any kind of money at all. It just becomes very hard, to nail down what the exact sales are going to be on that many titles. I think they're publishing, 400, 500, 600 comics a month or something ludicrous like that.
Although half the Marvels I was reading got canceled.
Well, yeah, and then they cancel and they reboot because there's some money to be made on a reboot, and sales kind of cascade as they go into issue 6, into issue 10, into issue 20, because and you get a bump out of having a first issue sales, and if your goal is to make that quarter profitable, you're probably going to want to have some number ones in there. There's all sorts of gimmicks you can do. They do these variant covers. They do all the things that they can to kind of prop things up. But I think fundamentally it comes down to there's just not enough comics readers for as many comics that are being published. And it's tough out there. It's tough. You're not only competing. I wonder, how much of the satisfaction that you can get from movies that you can see for free over and over again, or that are coming out, and I think that satisfies a lot of people. I always joke that when I was a kid, we would put on Tchaikovsky records and pretend like there was Lord of the Rings stuff that had to do with the music we were hearing. Whereas if I were a kid, 30 years later, I could have just popped it into the Blu-ray and seen those scenes actually come to life in front of me. I've been no contest. it was rougher. There was less fantastic material. There was less visually splendorous material to be had. Mm-hmm. So I think that is a factor too. They have to be really, really good and really, really smart about making these very, very small margins. And I think that it just might be an exhausted readership, and a readership hasn't replaced this exhausted readership.
Well, and Brian Hibbs had written a few months ago how his observation, running the comic shop in San Francisco, was the new audience that's attracted by things like Ta-Nehisi Coates writing Black Panther.
Sure.
They don't really get it when then Marvel puts out another Black Panther book and says, "Oh, now they're tied together and you have to buy two," or that kind of thing. On like, "Oh, now new number one." There was a time, they just kind of chase that audience away.
There was a time when you had a very sophisticated. I'm not as sophisticated in terms of like the pinky out on the wine glass, but sophisticated in terms of a fan that could follow all of these things. Mm-hmm. And I'll find even that I don't get half the stuff that they do sometimes, and they'll have like a different adjective on a book. Like one way that you used to be able to signpost comics if you were a reader of mainstream comics was that they generally had the same artist and writer. Mm-hmm. And because they have decided that they want to get out more of the more popular comics, there's almost no cartoonist that can do 18 issues of a single title anymore.
Yeah, in a year.
And so even the comics that are... even the comics that have a steady creator, he or she doesn't do all of that 18 issues.
Yeah, or like
and you can get
two
lost.
Artists will trade off arcs.
You can get lost, and there's times in which I don't understand like the various adjectives that describe the various X-Men teams. And if I try to follow, saying I will do the one my friend Stewart draws, then there's going to be a month where I go in and he didn't draw one that month, and it's like, well, which title was it? And I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about. I just knew that Stewart worked on that, and they just look at you like you're crazy. And let alone like if you're coming to those comics cold. Then yeah, that's a great example, that you're expected when you buy Black Panther that there's two other things that are like Black Panther to watch, and that's just not the way most people consume media. Consume media is a lovely term, by the way. Makes it sound really artistic and edifying.
Yeah.
So I just think I think it's a rough model, and I think when you have some bad behavior, when you have some, kind of reaching out constantly for and kind of flooding the market in terms of when something's popular with other titles or more of the same, it just comes back to it exhausts you after a while. And there's a point at which where those number one issues, they always say that's an opportunity to jump on. It's also an opportunity to jump off. Yeah. And I think a lot of longtime readers go, I'm spending $65 a week on my little stack of comics, and I don't even understand what's going on in this one. Yeah. And they changed the guy that I liked that was the character in this one.
You're wearing a stupid costume now.
Yeah, I just don't like this art style. It's very it's a market where you have to hit all of these things at once to make it work. And very few comics do that anymore. And what ends up being a profitable comic is often, creator-owned title at Image that reaches a certain threshold where they get that money back themselves. You also have a talent drain on the mainstream comics, on DC and in Marvel, and there's certainly plenty of people that still want to work for those companies. But one of the goals when I was a kid, when I was a kid reading comics, the goal was to be John Byrne. The goal was to be Peter David or Chris Claremont. These are company men or women, and now it's, Robert Kirkman and The Walking Dead. That sounds pretty good. That sounds pretty good. And one of the things about the Image books is that you get the Image deals, you keep the media rights, and so there's a chance, or Mark Miller, and there's a chance that you can sell those and have a kind of, I'm a guy who appears on The View and promotes my TV show and makes
actual money.
Makes actual money off the production and with licensing. And that's not, I couldn't do that if I had just stayed and written Ant-Man for all those years, because you're just not going to get credit. Jack Kirby barely gets credit, let alone you're writing whatever adventure gets turned into, I don't know. Sometimes some people have been rewarded over the years, but it's been really haphazard. So I get it. There are different models for success now. If you ask like most creators who they'd want to be, who would be like a grand example of, Brian Bendis, maybe, or you know, that's a great place to end up because Brian's had a really great career and a really unlikely and admirable career. But that might not be as appealing as what Robert Kirkman has going on, where you're suddenly doing stuff for TV shows.
Yeah.
And so that the model changes, and so therefore I think when you have all of these comics coming out, some of the talent is not up to the kind of importance of what that book should mean in a specific line. They will always find more people to draw, but they're not always going to find people that are well-suited right away.
Yeah, I've been hearing on iFanboy, sometimes they've been complaining about the low quality of the art in some of the mainstream books.
Maybe relative to the past, and maybe relative to the best artists going. I would think that there's some rough because they have a lot of titles to cover, and sometimes you're going to get new people, and sometimes they don't work out. You know, Marvel did a lot of books back in the early '90s when they were kind of aggressively like going after market share, and there were a lot, you know, like 3 or 4 Hulk titles, and there, you know, there's a lot of these books, and some of them didn't have. I don't know if Hulk actually split out that much. But there was a lot of multiple titles for different characters. And Spider-Man for sure had a bunch of titles.
Like every week there was a book.
And there are some people working that you look back on and you're like, whoa, this is really kind of energetic and crude and kind of cool looking, but wasn't maybe like the best. And there's a big difference doing that when you think your bottom is like 110,000 as opposed to 10,000, what it is now. So that's a rough field. I would never do it. No one's ever asked me to because I would be terrible at it. But I would just say that they're going through some very big cycle issues and a lot of little mistakes made along the way. And it's gonna stink for a little while. And it wouldn't surprise anyone if Marvel in particular looked completely different this time next year.
Check the show notes for a photo of me with Steve, Craig, Tom, and my friend Dahmer author Derf Backderf. Yes, Derf was also at the Billy Ireland the day I was there, and I'll have an interview with him coming up later this month. And he'll be appearing at CXC in Columbus at the end of this month, so if you're in the area, stop by the festival to see him and the other guests Tom mentioned. Tell us what you think. Write us at mail@deconstructingcomics.com, Twitter @deconcomics, like our Facebook page, or join our Facebook discussion group. All our social media links can be found on the right sidebar at deconstructingcomics.com. Also, please give us a review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or iHeartRadio. And we can be found on YouTube, on the Comics Podcast Network at comicspodcast.com, and on comiccon.com, where our new episodes appear a few days before they show up anywhere else. Our theme is from bensound.com. In the latest episode of To the Batpoles, some of the people I interviewed for Deconstructing Comics during my trip weigh in on Batman. They share their memories of watching Batman as kids and consider the question, what if someone else had played Batman? What did Adam West bring to the role? The episode includes a great talk with Steve Bissette and Craig Fischer, who you heard in this episode, as well as Dale Lazarov, Christopher Jones, Carl Kiesel, and more. Plus, none other than our very own mom shares her memories of watching us grow up with Batman and how her sewing skills helped us out on more than one occasion. Look up To the Batpoles wherever you find your podcast or at tothebatpoles.libsyn.com. If you're looking for some constructive feedback on your comic, send it to us and Mulele and I will critique it on our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Send it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We'll read at least 30 pages of it and critique it on the show. We're on a bit of a hiatus right now, but we expect to be back on September 28th. This Thursday, another bonus episode of Deconstructing Comics, in which Kumar and Emmett discuss the newly released Mr. Miracle #1. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.